Center for the Arts promotes, showcases, and supports the arts from across the African diaspora. As part of NIA Center's work, we're proud to showcase to you a series of artist conversations as part of our Left of Center program. Left of Center is a 2-year artist incubator that supports the careers of emerging Black artists working across a wide range of disciplines. And as part of the Left of Center program, you're here to listen to a series of artist conversations from folks like Sarah Ty Black, Kevin Ray, and more. These conversations are meant to support emerging artists in propelling their careers forward from everything from grant writing, developing artist statements, and empowering yourself as a Black creative in this city. Stay tuned for more, and if you have any questions, you can always email NIA Center at info@niacenter.org, or you can follow us online at NIA Center as well across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Okay. So today we're talking about understanding who you are as an artist and being able to communicate that to audiences, which I think is really critical for any artist, particularly Black artists who are emerging in their careers, to be able to be in touch with and able to articulate what their purpose and story is to a wide variety of artists. And I'm so glad to be joined today by Liz Ikiriko, who is an artist as well as teacher, curator, and photo editor. And sort of all of the hats that you've worn, you've seen artists develop in their journeys and articulate sort of what their purpose is through their art. And I think you can add great perspective today to this particular subject matter. But let's start off with an introduction. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I went to school in Calgary. I did my undergrad, the Alberta College of Art and Design, and I always knew I had a strong passion for photography, and I really had this focus. I had a very linear kind of idea of where I wanted to land. So at that time, I graduated and I moved straight to Toronto, and I wanted to be a music and editorial photographer. I'll do like just the short hops through my career because it's been a while. But I started off shooting editorially, and it was really wonderful. There was amazing opportunities that a city like Toronto presents. At the same time, it's a freelance life, and at that time I was having a hard time figuring out how to consistently pay my bills. So I was serving, and I also knew that if I wanted to be an editorial photographer, I would need something else to be kind of consistent to support me. So I started getting interested in photo editing. I always loved magazines and print publishing. So I ended up interning at Toronto Life magazine, and then freelancing at Maclean's, and then I became the photo editor at Toronto Life. And so I was there for 5 years. And then after that, I worked on a number of different projects and a number of different publications like Maclean's and Canadian Business and Away, which was a Toronto Pearson Airport magazine. Mm-hmm. And so there's a number of things like that. And then there's also other projects that kind of happened along the way. I did visual research at the CBC on George Stroumboulopoulos' show. And so there's all these different kinds of avenues that I started to explore within photography, but that took me away from being a photographer or an artist. And I was fine with that at that time. But the older I got, the more I have 2 kids, I started to really long for an opportunity to express myself again. And I did my master's at OCAD. I finished last year, and thanks. And it was in criticism and curatorial practice. And so there was always this anchor of wanting to focus on lens-based work, but I kind of wanted to branch out in terms of how I could do that. And so through that process, not only did I learn about understanding the contemporary art world and curating, which I was already doing, but this was a really kind of more in-depth way of researching and developing my practice. But I also understood how I need to work as an artist as well, and how that voice is very different than being a curator, and how much I appreciate both. And so there are all these hats that I've worn, and it's really I really think that there's so many ways that these different aspects have really informed all of the different aspects of what I do. And there are also the ways when I'm working with students or emerging artists that I can kind of see and hopefully help them develop their voice and hopefully find avenues for them to excel.
Such a vast career and range of experiences. I can only imagine how your artist bio and statement and how you describe your work has sort of changed and evolved over that process. Can you tell us a bit about, I guess, first, the difference between a bio and a statement?
For sure, yeah. I would say for one, artist bios and artist statements, the way I see them, they're always changing. They always have to be updated, just like a CV or a resume. So those are things that you can kind of have a structure that you're working with, but you're always going to want to reflect the things that you're doing and maintaining them and updating them regularly. In terms of an artist bio versus an artist statement, I would see the bio as being the basic information that is usually required from grant applications, residency applications, like a number of different places that kind of anchors who you are, what you do, what your accolades are, what's your education. They can be fairly to the point. So they don't get necessarily too involved in terms of what your work is fully about, but they might kind of have an overarching kind of conceptual ideas or things that you're exploring. And then an artist statement, there's more opportunity to be more creative and to really highlight the things that you do in your work. And that they can be harder to craft for an emerging artist, because I think there's still potentially, when you're just developing your practice, you're still trying to figure out what it is that you do and what are the things, what are the themes that you're focused on. But I think really starting with what you're interested in and trying to not add too many bells and whistles is probably the best plan. So keep things really short, start with your notes in terms of what are you interested in? Are you interested in portraiture? Are you interested in storytelling? Do you have narratives in your work? Are you interested in landscape? You can keep things very, very basic just to get your basics down, and then you can start crafting a statement from there.
That sounds good as sort of a starting point. Mm-hmm. And then how do you go about refining it? And I guess how frequently? I know you mentioned this is something that's sort of iterative and you're going to go back to it and edit it frequently. Mm-hmm. How often would you say you should be editing your bio and or statement?
I guess that's a tough one because I think everybody has a different approach. Mm-hmm. I curated a show in early 2020, which seems like 10 million years ago. But it was with Jamila Malika Abubakar and Camila Janan Rashid. And we were talking about bios and how challenging they are because they feel limiting. They feel fixed. And then there's always this way that you want to allude to the fact that you are not only these things, you are so many more things. And that's a real challenge. And I think that's a part of the aspect of wanting to continue to revise. And so I would say, if you have things that you're doing in terms of your bio, if you have things that are happening regularly, every time you do a panel discussion, or you receive, maybe you received a grant, those are things that I would include in your bio. So those would be the times that I would update them. Or if you're presenting in a group show or whatnot. And then in terms of an artist statement, I would say that's up to everybody in terms of how they're looking at their practice. If they've finished a new series of work, if they are thinking, I was really focused on portraiture in a more broad sense, but now I realize that I'm really interested in defining my work by having an activist lens, and that I'm really focused on supporting, underrepresented youth, or that you can kind of become more finessed in terms of how you're defining yourself.
That makes a lot of sense for it to evolve sort of with your work.
Yeah.
And is it important to, I guess in the bio, we're sort of clear on the format and the component parts. But is it important, I think sometimes artists, ask me about the language that's used. Is it important to use a particular language?
I think probably because I come from a number of different fields, I find that the thing that I'm very strongly anchored to is that language should be something that supports you, that supports your work, that supports your ideas. And if it doesn't do that, if you're using language that you don't fully understand or it doesn't fully express what you're wanting to say, but you're thinking that that's what is needed, then it's the wrong language for you. And that's okay, because I think everybody wants, when someone is reading your artist statement, they want to understand what it is you do. So if you're saying like I'm focused on an ontological approach, and your interest is in, like epistemological,
words, all the syllables.
Yeah. And yet you don't really fully understand like what that means, but you think that that's, what you're supposed to say, just scrap it, keep things simple. I think it will always go further if you can keep things genuine, and when you can be focused on what it is you want to present, and in a very clear voice. And artist statements are really challenging. I can read an artist statement that I have, and I think I'm regularly revising it. So
I'd love to hear that. I think it's good to hear both folks like their statement and then also like their intentions behind it, right? Because sometimes I feel like you read it and it elicits more questions, or it's sort of good to hear people break it down.
Yeah. So this is an artist statement that is not focused on a specific body of work. Then there's other artist statements that can be more specific to specific work, but this is a general one. So, whoops. My practice is anchored by thinking, making, writing, and curating on lens-based media that explores migration and corporeal archives for marginalized and hybridized people. I'm drawn to exploring and exposing hidden processes in order to weave obscured histories to new ceremonies of remembering. Motivated by tactile materials, my work considers the natural world as a way to actively bring bodies into relation with one another. So besides corporeal, I think that's the biggest word in my artist statement, but for the most part, I really wanted to talk about the fact that the things I'm thinking about in my work is I want to engage in having like an embodied experience for the viewer of my work. I want it to be, most of my work is made from natural materials. I am thinking about the hidden histories of Black folk in Canada, specifically because I grew up in the prairies. These are stories that are often, or just recently, they feel like they're being unearthed more often than they have been. So those were kinds of the things. So I kind of wrote down like a number of themes that recur in my work, and then I could kind of start to fine tune and craft them into
things that you're drawn to, and then pull that together.
Yeah.
I just had an image. I just like when you were reading, I thought of a piece that I've seen of yours where I think it's you in like a backyard and it's grassy, and just thinking of like you pulling, people and ideas like towards you outside, So I see get a sense of, the work that you want to do and bringing others and other voices and particular kinds of voices into your work.
Totally.
Thank you so much for sharing that and giving us some background on it. Are there any tips? Because I know artist statements and bios are a key part of applying for grants and submissions and awards and residencies. Are there any tips that you would give to emerging artists on creating a strong application, in addition to some of the pieces we just chatted about?
I would say that, you can write a standard artist bio or artist statement, but I think that there's always going to be finessing for whatever your application is. So make sure that when you are, say you're writing a grant application, it's so important to go over the very specific details. Sometimes there's just like word count issues. So, it can't be over 200 words. Okay. So, and really like follow those to a T, because usually you can't apply, like you can't submit anything over that. Yeah. But on top of that, those are just like standard rules. But then on top of it, there's with grant applications, they will let you know what they're looking for. And they can be very specific in terms of, we're looking for emerging artists that are working in this capacity, or that are community minded, or, all of these things. And so consider those aspects when you're writing your bio. So if you generally, there's ways that you're going to have to finesse the language in your bio that's going to cater to each application that you make. And it's really important to really consider that in terms of where this is going, like how you can prove to them that is who you are, or that is the work that you are also aligned with.
Right. And thinking too about their strategic objectives, like if this is for emerging artists and lens-based work who want to grow in their practice, that you're able to sort of articulate how are you growing in your practice for this particular one. So having a sort of standard bio and statement allows you then to jump off into apply to other projects and that sort of thing, where you might have to adapt it as needed.
For sure.
Yeah, so it shouldn't be static.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to other kinds of documentation, resumes and CVs. What's the difference?
So main difference between a resume and a CV. Resume is your work experience. It's basically like anchored by that. So including your education, but a CV would be really focused on your exhibition history and other creative outlets public outlets that you've had. So whether you've been published, whether you're writing, or your work has been published in a magazine, your education is more of a priority. You can also include your work experience, but for a CV, that's more focused on, have you been in group shows? Have you had solo exhibitions? Has your work traveled? Have you submitted to, to publications, online, whatnot? And so that's really the anchor of a CV. It's a little different. Like you can do kind of hybrids. I would always suggest that people look online for just like kind of basic templates to use and to follow them quite closely. But you can do a bit of work experience if it's relevant to whatever, like especially what you're applying for.
Right.
But they have to be 3 pages, no longer. So don't get too verbose when you're crafting your resume or your CV.
Yeah, I know some artists, particularly when they're emerging, are concerned that it's not full enough.
Right.
And feeling like, they don't have enough experience.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any tips to include there? Maybe like community projects, does that count? Or involvement in mentorship programs?
100%. Yeah, I really think that it's so important to show the work that you're not only that you're doing, or that you're hired to do, or that you're, where you're exhibiting or you're exhibiting your work, but it's also really important to show the things that you're passionate about. So if you're volunteering, if you're doing these things, and it doesn't have to be 3 pages too, it can be 1 or 2 pages. I think that there is a real craft to refining your language, and that can be done through practice. So for instance, like if you've shown, and this applies more to your bio or your artist statement, but if you have shown in a group show that was in Vancouver, and then another show that maybe was in the prairies, you can say that you have exhibited your work nationally.
Right.
Across Canada.
Right.
So there's a few things like that really do make a difference in terms of the way that you're presenting your work. You might be like, what? That was like a group show that my friend put on and they just asked me to send something, and you did. It still counts.
And I think so often emerging artists and Black artists diminish those kinds of things.
Yes.
And yet there's such an integral part of both their career, their skill sets, their experience. They learned something out of those things, and ultimately it added to how Black stories and visual culture is represented in another city or a particular space. So it's important to think through all of those things you've kind of collaborated with your friends on, and talk about the value of it.
Yeah, because you're building an archive, even though that it sounds. You probably don't think of the work that you're doing, but if you are showing your work in some capacity across Canada or internationally, you're building this archive. You're making a place for yourself and for other people to reflect on in the years to come, and that's really important work. And sometimes it's really that's one of the great things about writing an artist statement, bio, CV, or resume is that it's a good time to actually think about the work that you're doing and its importance, because it is valid. It's very important. And like that's something that we need to be reminding ourselves of, especially as Black artists and curators. Like that's work that I think that that's the most consistent thing I see in emerging artists, is not valuing how important it is that we're doing this work.
Yeah, such an important point, because that is really what underpins all of it, is that we are creating this archive, and in the absence of a proper archive of Black expression in this country, doing it personally is so important, that you're documenting your own contribution, so that one day when we do have these spaces and awards and other platforms, that we can go back to your personal archive to say, this was the early beginnings of this expression or this technique or whatever it is. So another medium to share your work would be a website, which is particularly important in this digital era. Is this something that you would recommend artists invest in, and sort of at what point in your career do you think it's important to invest in a website?
I think as early on as possible. If you feel that you have bodies of work that you have developed, that you're proud of, that you feel respect or represent your work clearly, I would say build a website, and if you can afford it, like do it as soon as possible, because you need to start kind of, making a mark for yourself. And it's really great when you start deciding to go out in the world and reach out to curators and art directors or photo editors or whatnot, for them to be able to do a quick search and see what you're up to. And like, everyone's going to look on social media, or they're going to look for your website. So I think they're still going to look at social media. So like how you represent yourself there is also important. It's important to think of, your public persona or representation.
But if you have nothing there, because some artists don't have a lot of work on their social media.
Right.
So then the question becomes like, where am I getting this information?
That's why the website's important, because that kind of is the way that you can direct your vision of what you want people to see of you and of your work. Because otherwise, if people are just looking at Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or TikTok, like that might not accurately represent your work. So you need to have some anchor of what you're doing or how you want people to perceive you. And websites now are really simple. I would say, so when I started photo editing, photographers would send printed promos, and then they would also ask to meet with me so that I could go over their printed portfolios.
Oh, wow.
And these would be beautiful books, beautiful portfolios, and they still happen, but very rarely. But they were really expensive to create, because you had these huge books that you would go through. And now
full scale glossy photos.
Yeah. And like also, not to date myself, but like way back in the day, like websites websites can still cost a lot, but commercial photographers would spend thousands of dollars developing these very slick, very good looking websites. But now there's so many opportunities with, like Format is a really wonderful hosting site that has beautiful templates, and it takes 10 minutes to devise a very slick looking website that does all the things you need. So you don't need to necessarily work with art directors or designers. You can craft it all yourself. They're very user intuitive. Same with Squarespace. So I would say that that's like, just keep it simple, no bells and whistles. Like in terms of as a photo editor and as a curator, I want to be able to see, if I'm thinking editorially, I want to be able to see the work that you're developing, the work that you're passionate about, so your personal work. And I want to know where you are in the world. So and if you happen to travel a lot, I want to know, like,
where are you based?
Yeah.
I have that question a lot too. Where people's feed or website is very abstract, and I'm like, are you in this country or not? Just some of the basics. And it's like, it's great if you want to be part of like the global, audience, you want to have a
Yeah.
global audience, but like getting down to some of the basics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I work with you now?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we make like a coffee date, or is that possible? Or are you? Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a bit about platforms, which is great, and I think it's such an important point that the barrier for being able to showcase your work to different audiences or a photo editor or curator has dropped because you're not walking around with this portfolio. So putting the effort into a website sort of pushes you across that boundary of being able to be found and able to see your work.
For sure.
When did you create your website?
Quite a long time ago, and I had a website, an early website when I first moved to Toronto. So I was quite young, and then I took it down because it was just, at that time I was an editorial photographer, so it had my work up, and it marketed me as an editorial photographer. And so that was when I was I was shooting for the Now and a number of different magazines and stuff. And so that's what it was there for. And then when I started getting into photo editing, I took it down because it didn't need to be there. Right. So that was like 20 years ago. And I was right out of school. That was the first thing. When I first started showing my portfolio to photo editors and art directors, they would always ask, and I'd always leave like business cards or promos, and I had to have my website on it. That was necessary. Yeah. So that was when I threw something together. It was basic. I'm back to basic. I have a website now. It's very basic, but it just shows, like, it really is just, it updates in terms of when I update it, it just has the information in terms of the things I'm working on or the things I've just accomplished.
Right up to the time.
Yeah.
What Liz is doing now.
Yeah.
So one other element, I guess, to think about that I think is an underutilized tool for artists to sort of get to know curators and sort of other folks working in the field is studio visits. Mm-hmm. And I know I heard from a lot of emerging artists, what is a studio visit? What do I say? What happens? Could you give us a bit of insight into?
Yeah, for sure. They can be super daunting. I think for an emerging artist, they can be really terrifying because, like, so if you have a studio that also is your bedroom or your kitchen table, it can feel like a little strange to be like, yeah, sure, I'll conduct that studio visit. There's a number of different ways you can go about it. It depends on who you're meeting and the kinds of relationships that you have with them, and or if you don't have a relationship with them and you don't feel comfortable having someone, we're speaking in a pandemic, but let's say outside of a pandemic, if you were to have someone physically in your space, you would have to decide, is this the space? Like if it is like a work live space, do you feel comfortable having a stranger in your space and seeing how you actually make work? And if not, that's okay. Yeah. And a lot of people will either rent or borrow a friend's studio space to showcase some of their work. And you can also like kind of set it up so that you can be like, this is how I practice, or this is how I do work. Right. That's an option. I think this, like right now, there's a lot of studio visits that I've conducted online and through Zoom. And I personally kind of like them. I think in some ways it gives more control to the artist, or it makes them feel like they have some control. And it ends up being more of a conversation in terms of what they're interested in, like how their practice has evolved, and it has less to do with their physical space, right, depending on what the work is.
So studio visits are a way to invite curators, could be a potential collaborator, editor, anyone sort of that has the potential to work with you to sort of advance your career into your space, whether that be, your home or a space that you set up. I think that's a really great tip to just find a neutral space or a friend space and sort of set that up and have a conversation about who you are, what you do, what your practice is, showcase sort of what that looks like kind of behind the scenes and where you're going or like to go. Yeah.
And I would say don't worry about if you don't have like a full realized body of work, that's okay too. I think sometimes the best thing about studio visits is being able to see work in progress, and it's really exciting for a lot of curators to be able to see something that's in development, because that means that there's a potential that I can maybe work with you on that series, that we could then find a gallery that we could show that work in a year or two. And it's not that when you do studio visits as well, it's good to remember that they're not necessarily, there's no outcome that's necessarily.
Right. You're not pitching.
Yeah, you're not pitching. There's no specific expectation that this is going to kind of develop into something. It's really building relationships with curators, directors, writers, with different galleries. And it's wonderful because if they know, oh, yeah, you're interested in, hair braiding.
Landscapes, or hair braiding,
then they might see like a call for submissions, or they may have a call for submissions in a few months, and they're like, oh my gosh, we've got a call because we did this studio visit, and this is perfect for them.
We know a bit more about your work and where you want to go.
Yeah.
So critical. And I think that it's an underutilized sometimes resource. Yeah. But I'm really glad that we're able to sort of touch a bit on the value of it and who you would invite. Because I know that's the other question for folks is like, well, who do I invite to this visit? Yeah. And so depending on your discipline, it could be different people. But generally, folks who are going to be interested in potentially working with you in the future, or might have insight or advice.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of inviting, which I think is a really great idea, like to be actually proactive and reach out to either like young curators or writers. I mean, those are key people to contact. So I think doing your research beforehand too, and looking at like what writers are writing critically about artists that you love or that you like, and that are that live in Toronto or like live locally, so that you could actually develop those relationships is amazing. Like that would be a great idea. And in terms of, and that those, you can start to finesse, like hopefully those develop into really strong relationships. There's a lot of curators that will work with specific artists because they're building a relationship, and then they show them regularly. Right.
This has all been really great insights. Is there anything that you would say to Black artists right now?
I would say that there is incredible amounts of opportunity that haven't existed quite the same previously. And that can be really exciting, and it is really exciting. There are numerous new platforms for Black artists to showcase their work in Canada. And I think that those are wonderful opportunities to take advantage of. I also hope that doesn't add added pressure, because there is a certain quality to our time right now where it feels like that the focus on Black art could be seen by dominant culture as a trend or a style, as opposed to being the fact that we have always been here, we have always been makers, we have always been doing this work. And so I would say I hope that there are opportunities in this time to really make sure that you're reflecting on your own work and making sure that you're making work that you want to make, not responding to a specific time period, and that you are not just responding to the fact that, like whatever said like multi-million-dollar company is looking for like the newest, hottest, and we want activists, like creators. Yeah. So like, I would hope that you don't get caught up in the sway of that sort of kind of commentary that we're witnessing right now, and making sure that you're really focused on the long game, which is, I think, really exciting when I think about that. The connections that are being made between Black artists in Toronto, in Canada, in North America, globally, are the things that really sustain me these days.
Thank you.
Thanks.